Well, welcome everyone to the CG webinar. And today we've got a handbook series launch of the Bloomsbury Handbooks of Crises and Transformative Leadership in Higher Education. And we've got three great speakers from that project to introduce it for you. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to put you through the webinar protocols as we usually do at this stage. Now, please remember that the webinar is recorded so that your words of wisdom in the Q&A part of the discussion will find their way onto YouTube within a couple of days on our YouTube channel, CG YouTube channel, and you'll be able to reach the recording also through the CG website. Now, during the webinar, we advise you to keep your sound off, keep muted, because extraneous noise can sometimes interfere with the sound and interrupt the speakers. You don't really need to have your camera on either, although there's nothing wrong with having it on. But the main one is to watch is your mic. Now, to enter the discussion part of the webinar, we advise you to use the chat function. Bring up the chat to yourself, then send your question or your comment on the presentation to me through the chat. You can send it to everyone through the chat as you see fit. And then I'll select the speaking order on the basis of what's coming in through the chat. When you're asked to speak, turn on your mic, most important, turn on your camera if you can, and then tell us who you are and where you are from. If you're selected into the webinar, as you probably will be if you come in early enough in the chat, then I'll send you a little message in the chat just to tell you that we're going to bring you in, so you won't be surprised by that. And during the webinar, we advise you to use speaker view there in the top right-hand corner with the big red arrow, because that enables you to see what's going on. You can see who's speaking at any given time. Okay, that's the housekeeping. Now let's switch to the webinar itself and the launch of the Bloomsbury Handbooks on Crises and Transformative Leadership in Higher Education. And this will be led off by Mary Drinkwater, who's a lecturer in leadership, higher and adult education and comparative international and development education at the very famous OISE, Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in the University of Toronto, one of the world's leading centres for education research in the university sector. She's also a faculty lead curriculum research at Yorkville University, and Mary's research interests include critical and decolonial theory and praxis in education, transformative education, critical leadership, educational policy development. With her, we have Yousef Wahid, who's a leading African philosopher of higher education, intent on advancing democratic citizenship education, cosmopolitan education, and global citizenship education in the context of equitable redress and change, equality, non-discrimination, non-sexism, and justice for all. And I think all those themes will resonate with many people who use our webinars. A lot of us are working in related areas. He draws on multiple traditions of thought, most notably combining dominant aspects of Western and non-Western theories of knowledge to rethink philosophy of education in Africa. And he sets out this thinking in his most recent book, Philosophical, Educational, and Moral Openings in Doctoral Pursuits and Supervision. And isn't moral education becoming more important? I mean, I think in a lot of places that's being discussed. Our third speaker, we are very pleased to have with us Patrick Dean, Principal Vice-Chancellor and Professor of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Canada, and previously the President of McMaster. Many will know of him in that role, and he's held senior leadership roles in the Canadian Academy for about 20 years. His own scholarly focus is on British culture and politics in the 20th century. And haven't you got a lot of material to work on now? So much going on, most of it not very good, I have to say. Well, without further ado, let me hand over to Mary, who's going to lead the webinar from here. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Simon. Let me just start this from the beginning there. There we go. So again, welcome on behalf of both Patrick and Yousef. Welcome to all who are here in attendance with us today. And because we only have an hour, We'll have to race through a little bit when we do the overview of the volumes, but we're going to try and at least give a quick overview of the content of each of the 4 volumes and the chapters within it. So the agenda, we'll do a short acknowledgement, and then Patrick will be doing a dedication. We'll go over the background and the impetus for the whole handbook series. We'll present the theoretical framework of transformative leadership theory that grounds and guides the discussion throughout the 4 volumes. I'll give you just a tiny background on the thematic analysis and the 4 overarching themes that came out, an introduction to the handbook preface and a structure of the series and each of the volumes, and then we'll get into the 4 volumes, and I will do 2 of them, Yusuf will do the 3rd one, and I'll come back in for the Ethics of Care volume. And then we'll give you a little bit of information on how to pre-order the whole series or individual handbooks. So in terms of the welcome, we welcome to everyone that's here, but in particular, the family and friends and colleagues of Narend Bajna, representatives from the Council of Higher Education and the Commonwealth of Learning, and also from the University of Johannesburg. And it's so wonderful to be able to join with and celebrate with all of these chapter authors who we have worked with for almost 2 years in putting the handbook series together. For me, it's also so great to be able to see many of the students, faculty members, researchers, and leaders in higher education institutions and associations around the world joining us. A short acknowledgement, but an important acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that this handbook series was developed, edited, and published on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. We reaffirm our role and continue to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And we also acknowledge that we need to continue to deepen our understanding of the colonial impact on Indigenous peoples and their lands, and of the diverse Indigenous knowledges and ways of being. And as transformative leaders in institutions of higher education, we acknowledge that this deepening of understanding can help all of us to strengthen our relations with our human and our more than human relations as we move forward through the many, many planned and unplanned crises that are ahead. I'd also like to acknowledge Yorkville University and Queen's University for their funding support to be able to hire 3 graduate students, a tremendous opportunity for these graduate students to be involved in the copy editing process of the handbook series. And I know 2 of them are here with us, E.K. Barawa and Nia Spooner, and the 3rd was Cassandra Cameron. So again, to Yorkville and to Queen's, thanks for the funding. Simon, again, thanks for your gracious forward to the handbook series. It will be in the front of each of the 4 volumes. I think Alison Baker is here. Alison and Alyssa Burns from Bloomsbury, thanks for all of your support. And most importantly, to the chapter authors, thank you for bringing in, unpacking, and sharing your leadership experiences, and also for, as you'll see in this handbook series, the rich and diverse transnational perspective. We have over 120 chapter authors from 6 continents, so bringing in the voices and perspectives from many areas around the world. Patrick, the dedication.
Thanks very much, Mary. Mary mentioned that we're very pleased to have with us today many of the family and colleagues of Narend Bajnath, who we all remember today, and to whom we have dedicated this series of books. Narend died coincidentally 2 years ago tomorrow, and was a great loss to all of us who knew him and worked with him. I think it's well known. He was Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa. He was the chair of the Commonwealth of Learning, fellow of St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, CEO for a period of the South African Council on Higher Education, a research professor at the Open University, and a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. these amongst his many accomplishments as a very influential thinker and practitioner in higher education. I came to know Narend in my capacity as president of the Governing Council of the Magna Carta Observatory. We came onto the Governing Council of that organization at the same time. And we also were part of a group which drafted the new Magna Carta Universitatum Declaration for 2020. During that time, I developed an enormous admiration for Narend, for his wisdom, and for the values that he brought to leadership in higher education. And I can't think of anyone to whom it would be more fitting for us to dedicate this series of books, which, as Mary said, is intended to be a guide and support to those of us who do these jobs in a changing and always challenging world. Early on, when Mary first came up with the idea of the first book, it was to be a one-book project. The focus was very much on COVID and on how universities and their leaders had reacted to COVID. It was Narend who said, no, the challenges will be many and different in the years to come, and so we needed to broaden the scope of this. And indeed we did. So it's with great pleasure and of course regret at the loss of Narend that we dedicate these books to his memory. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Patrick. As in all writing, I've asked Patrick and Yusuf to share just a little bit, and I will start a little bit of situating ourselves going into it. And Patrick already alluded to some of the impetus for the handbook. For me, I go back and I reflect. I was a child of the 60s and the early 70s. And in that time, youth around the world were extremely active, expressing their voice, as Patrick just mentioned when we came in this morning again. And I heard this on CBC this week, this era of youth becoming much more engaged in the issues and crises around the world. But that began my informing of the need for transformative leadership and the role that institutions of higher education could play. In teacher education in the 70s was a great time for humanistic education. And it's really nice to see 50 years later, 40 to 50 years later, that this is really coming back, especially through the voices and through the learnings and through the reflections on other ways of knowing and being. I am a mother of 5 adult children and soon to be 11 grandchildren. And so I think and I reflect on the past and the future roles of and the responsibilities of higher education institutions to shape and to transform the world that our children and grandchildren will be moving into. And the impetus for this handbook started, as Patrick said, during COVID, when leaders were scrambling. There were no lessons. Everything was changing. Every time you turned around, there was new information coming in. So the questions were always how to lead and what would be the impact of that leadership. And that started the seed planting for the research question that I took to Patrick and asked if he would be interested in taking it on with me in terms of why, for what, and how can leaders, very broadly defined, lead during these periods of crisis and change in higher education around the world. Patrick, a little bit of your own situating.
Thanks, Mary. Well, I'm that very common species. I'm an example of that very common species, the accidental university administrator. I never intended to do this kind of work. As Simon said at the start, I have been doing it for now well over 25 years at either the presidential or the vice presidential level, but never intended it. Like Narend, I grew up in South Africa. The intention was, in fact, to be a human rights lawyer and to have impact on society and to do the work of social justice through that activity. By a strange series of life surprises, I found myself eventually, however, a student of literature and essentially thinking about the same issues from the point of view of what universities and the advancement of culture and thought about culture and reflection can do to help create a just and a decent society. And it's through that channel that I came into higher administration. Now, just getting back to the issue of being an accidental administrator, I do remember with some chagrin my first couple of months on the job in Winnipeg as a new vice principal academic, really being completely at sea without any thought about organizational issues and how to run an organization. And like so many of us, I learned through doing it, but would certainly have welcomed exposure to some case studies of the sort that we've included in the volumes and some theoretical analyses of what's involved in this work. I'll just end by saying that the lesson that I came to very early on in this work was that it's very difficult to do without a firm and strong commitment to a set of values that you can believe in and continue to advance. And through those 25 plus years of doing this work and the various challenges that I have dealt with, as so many colleagues have, it is having that firm set of values that has really helped me make progress. It's brought us through COVID, and now, as Mary just remarked, we're in another very challenging time for higher education leaders, and it has never been more important to be very clear on the values are that we should be espousing and defending. Thanks, Mary. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Patrick. Yusuf?
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I was attracted to this particular work on transformative leadership in higher education because I knew when I was about to engage with this particular work, it would invariably change me again and again and again. So I remain forever grateful for the opportunity to have read all the works that I've been engaged with, because the thinking that constitutes the work of you, the contributors in particular, have really made an indelible impact on me. So my thinking of transformative leadership in higher education is different. And if you ask me, and you will hear this afternoon, so what is that thinking? Is that thinking now fixed? No, the answer is that thinking is always in becoming, because there's no conclusion and finality about anything in education. If we really want to see the end of higher education, we have to come up with a fixed plan. And this is not what I've learned through engaging with the contributions in this book. So that is what attracted me to this project.
Thanks, Yusuf. I'll give you a little bit of background on the theoretical framework that we chose to ground the discussion, to ground the topic choices, to ground the research. And as we were looking at it, we chose this model. It's drawn from the work of Shields and Hesball on transformative leadership theory. But again, as Yusuf said, the real lessons of this handbook series are that it is constantly looked at, questioned, challenged, morphed, and molded, and a number of other theories that relate in other ways to transforming organizations have also been brought in. And you'll hear from Yusuf about cosmopolitan leadership. And in the final volume in Williams and her colleagues, they challenged us, challenged all of you who read the volumes, to reimagine transformative leadership within higher education by proposing human planetary futures based on Indigenous-led strategies of multi-generational resistance. So again, different ways that we can think about the role and purpose of higher education in becoming a transforming organization. Through the COVID times, through many crises, various inequities become illuminated. And so the role and the challenge is, how can you as an institution, you as a leader within an institution, begin to transform, to help it to become more democratic, more equity-based, more social justice-based, through and bringing in ethical change. So when we went back through the times of COVID or any crisis, these give institutions of higher education the opportunity to go back. Patrick mentioned values, but to go back and actually look at their mission and vision and values to see how these connect, and to reflect on what their role is, or what they would like their role to be as a transforming organization, sometimes at the local level, sometimes at the global level, and often at both in both contexts. And if you notice the arrows on the theoretical framework, you'll find as you read through the volumes, many authors have engaged with different arrows in one way or another. And there will be many examples shared within those chapters. The call for proposal and the thematic mapping. Again, Patrick and I met at the very beginning, and then we met with Alison Baker at Bloomsbury. With Naren's help, before Naren passed away, we developed the call for proposal and sent it out very broadly and widely through all of the different associations and organizations that we knew. Coming back after the summer, we ended up having, I think at that time, over 79 chapters come in. And as Patrick said, the original intent or original thought was to have one volume. But as we realized and saw the interest and the diversity of interest that was coming in, we realized we had to do a mapping exercise. So Yusuf, Patrick, and I went through all of the proposals and came up with these 4 themes, although they changed and they morphed slightly throughout the fall of 2022 and eventually settled on these 4 areas. So values and ethical change is one volume, context is the second, diversity is the third, and ethics, something called an ethics of care, which we'll explain in a moment, became the 4th. The Handbook series preface, it will be at the beginning of each of the 4 volumes, and basically it introduces the context, and Naren helped to write this introduction, but this context of global crises and unrelenting change and disruption, and that all of these crises and change have influenced and illuminated both the challenge and the opportunities for institutions of higher education. But as a result of the complex situatedness of each of these higher education institutions, the issues of what is a crisis and what types of change they're experiencing become quite different. And context becomes the theme of the second volume, but you'll see throughout the 4 volumes that there's a realization and a recognition of the importance of context, and also of dynamism, constantly changing, and fluidity, that issues and change are ongoing. So the volume structure, each of the volumes have either 17 or 18 chapters. They have an introductory chapter, which introduces the overarching theme of the volume, and then they have a concluding chapter, which pulls together and synthesizes the learnings from across the volume and creates a set of key lessons for educational leaders. Each of the volumes are also divided into 3 to 4 sub-themes or parts. And I'll begin with introducing the first volume. And again, due to time, There are 70 chapters. We will try and give just a very small snippet on each of the chapters within the volumes. And then we'll invite the chapter authors. As I said to Patrick and Yusuf, looking at the participant list, we have representatives from almost 60 of the 70 chapters within the volume series. So we'll invite chapter authors. If there's a question that's, or if you have a question that you would like to direct to one of the chapter authors, please take a look at the participants. And you'll see as we mention the various chapter authors, you'll see if they're present, and we've invited them to join us for the discussion. So an overview of this first volume, Values and Ethical Change. And as I read this and thought about it after, and again, this is where, as Yusuf said, you learn so much going through these volumes, because I head down and we write in the introductory chapter in this volume about the need to prepare for crisis and change, if that's possible, through a series of proactive change leadership strategies. Yet, as I read, I think Petro is here, Petro Dupreez and Leslie Lagrange, they argue that it is not a proactive or a reactive approach that should be used, but something they call an intra-active leadership approach, where you're working with all the different actors within and outside your organization to think about and to plan for, if you can in advance, crises and change. As Patrick said, regardless, it is important, it's vital to build this strong foundation of values and ethical principles. And with the increasing impact of neoliberal globalization that is happening to institutions of higher education around the world, it's really challenging institutions and leaders at times to think about the purpose of education. Where is their institution going and why? And it's important, it does raise issues and hopefully conversations about values and about the ethical complexities, because you're dealing with many, many diverse individuals and groups within the institution. In the opening chapter, we have 3 areas called ethical leadership, ethical change, and values-informed leadership. And values-informed leadership looking at culture and contextual considerations, because as you all would understand, values are not a common set agreed upon by all within an institution. So many, many challenges, debates, process pieces needed. Let me see, I'm blocking, my little tab bar is blocking the end. So the 3 sections within the opening volume are values and leadership, ethical change, and new ways forward, thinking, new visioning, new ways forward with values and ethical principles. Stephanie Marshall, and I'll give 1 or 2 sentences about each of the chapters so that you'll have an understanding. Marshall she opens up this volume and presents a conceptual framework of the concept of values-informed leadership that she drew from lessons that she learned from leaders in higher education institutions around the world as they undertook what she called rapid reappraisal of their universities from their existing approach of business as usual to other models throughout the period of the crisis. And it was developed during the COVID crisis era. David Locke and John Davies bring their work in from an organization called the Magna Carta Observatory based in Bologna, Italy. And they bring in their work based on a project that they call Living Values with universities around the world. And they share lessons on how values are clarified and how staff and stakeholders have been engaged with a view to enabling university leaders to develop a more profound way of earning the trust and serving society. And those elements of trust and of service, and again of impact on the local and global context, you'll hear over and over throughout the volumes. Sandra Donater presents a case study and an application chapter in the development of a new global engagement strategy that she was developing or leading during the 2 years of COVID. And she discusses the challenges and the opportunities of using values-informed leadership to move in a new direction of ethical change in their process of moving forward the concept of internationalization. Maestry's chapter is largely a theoretical chapter on the impacts of neoliberalism on academic autonomy and faculty experience in higher educations in South Africa. And it's a very forward-thinking chapter. She uses something called Stiglerian new technologies to re-envision diversity, inclusion, and faculty engagement. And then Ralph Sinclair finishes off the first section in volume 1, and he argues the why, in whose interest, and for what purpose of using a framework that he calls learning-centered leadership. And he asserts that learning should be the overarching value, commitment, and ethical center of higher education. So again, looking at different values, in this case, learning. Second section is around ethical change. It starts out with Mariana Papastefanou. Mariana was unable to join us today. She used a very interesting nautical metaphor of a ship. And we often hear about leadership and leadership on ships or on boats, especially in times of crisis. And she challenges this. And she uses the metaphor to critique the normativization within many dominant leadership approaches. And she argues that to become value-informed enough to advance ethical change, leadership requires a much more complex and multidimensional conception of justice and a complex ethic that is adequate enough to be differentiated during critical times. So she challenges these leadership approaches that are just sent out there and adds in the complexity that needs to be considered given the context. Gonsalves argues that in addition to transmitting and creating knowledge, higher educations also have a mission or a role in contributing to the socioeconomic development, both locally and globally. And some of the chapter authors across these 4 volumes speak about the issues and the contexts that need to be considered in socioeconomic development. Gonsalves draws on empirical research and case studies, and she argues that during times of change, there's a set of principles that there needs to be a set of principles that ensure that leadership contributes to the professional preparation that are both qualified for work and at the same time active and committed citizens. So you have this balancing of values between socioeconomic development and becoming active and responsible and engaged citizens. And then Lester Brian Shawa, situates his chapter in the South African context during COVID times, and he argues that in responding to global crises, disruption, and uncertain futures, African higher education leaders need to develop resilient systems informed by an Ubuntu ethic. And Ubuntu comes in as well in the final volume when we talk about a broader understanding of an ethic of care. Alison Taysom, who's unable to join us today, her chapter is set in this political context between the UK and the US, and she critiques 2 different approaches to credentializing professionals, which have the potential to either innovate or reduce democratic and ethical change. Taysom posits this new model, which she draws from the work of Kant, which aims to improve accountability, transparency, effectiveness, and trustworthiness in higher education institutions through an expansion of active, inclusive, equitable, and participatory citizenship, empowered by what she argues is a democratic rule of law. The last section in the first volume is a forward thinking and looks at new ways forward and the role of values and ethical principles in new ways forward. It starts out with a chapter by Lucas Walsh, which is a case study set in the Australian context at the time of multiple local, national, and global crises. Walsh uses an autoethnographic narrative approach, and he uses these multiple uncertainties to frame a critical discussion of the idea of a university leader as a concept that he and one of his earlier co-authors, Black, term homo promptus. And leading during the intersecting crises of natural disaster, political upheaval, and the pandemic, necessitated a focus on values-informed leadership that were deeply human-centered. And you'll hear this necessity to go back to what I call humanity consciousness, again, brought out by chapter authors across the volumes. Steve McGregor introduces a chapter which talks about the concept of network leadership to strengthen and support cross-institutional knowledge mobilization and capacity building. He looks at the theoretical framework about knowledge mobilization and contrasts the themes from the literature with findings from a research study that he's conducting right now on an institution called the Research Impact Canada. And he argues that in addressing the future and current challenges, moving beyond individualistic approaches or individualistic values to more relationally oriented and collaborative approaches is what's needed to address the challenges. Eftenaro and Leitch present another theoretical and conceptual chapter, and they draw on their research and literature review to look at domains and dimensions of leadership. Neesham and her colleagues use a case study approach. They begin with a case study of Sir John Shin, and they use that to deepen the understanding and the relevance of values-informed leadership. So they start with a case study and then extend it. And Srivastava and Archana, the final chapter in this volume, present another case study situated in India in the National School of Drama in the context of something that is called a self-organized learning environment. And they discuss the values, the use of a values-informed approach, which they call collaborative leadership. So again, the values of collaboration in taking aim at what they call the learning crisis and the lack of student engagement. Second book is around context. And again, the considerations of context and multi-context. Context is not singular, even though it sounds singular. It's a multi-context, and it's the intersections of the multiple types of context that often need to be brought in as leaders are thinking about their transformative change process. I introduce in the opening chapter in this second volume, introduce a model of context and comparative analysis presented or developed by Phillips and Schweisfurth in 2014. You'll see we come back to that model again at the very end when we draw key lessons from the 4 volumes. And again, there is no one size fits all. And you see that throughout especially in this volume that draws from many, many different countries and contexts. But what one can do is something called cross-fertilizing, cross-pollinating, or finding a third space. So looking at ideas from different areas, whether it's policy, practice, or pedagogy, and resituating it. And I'll come back to that at the very end, recontextualizing. So the 4 sections in this one, let me see how we're doing. I think we may have to, Yusuf and Patrick, I think in the interest of time, may have to just introduce the sections, and then I'll have to leave it up to, you'll at least be able to reach out to chapter authors, either in the discussion today or after you've read their chapter. The four sections within the context volume are skills, strategies, and dispositions, partnerships at the local, regional, or cross-national level, the impact of technology and the opportunity and considerations, and then again, a forward-thinking section on new visions related to or connected to context. 7 chapters in, and again, this PowerPoint will be available for you on the CGHE website after the webinar, so you will be able to take a closer look at the chapters within each of these volumes. And again, hopefully reach out to some of these authors with further questions. A whole series of chapters coming from different contexts around the world, but all looking at the development of skills, strategies, and dispositions. The second section has 3 chapters in it, looking at partnership development, both the opportunities and the challenges, partnerships broadly defined at the local, regional, and cross-national levels. And the third section looks at the impacts of technology. 3 chapters here, quite interesting. Again, during COVID and post-COVID, you can see the diversity of areas that people are exploring and investigating in this section. And the last section is the forward-looking. Pembitsioglu in Turkey, he does a historical comparative analysis between the past approaches to leadership and the present, and the issues and challenges, opportunities and challenges. I'll have to leave the rest of Andres Valencia. In this one, he does something called scenario building, and he looks at these 4 different scenarios in the Latin American and Caribbean context. Very interesting in terms of possible models for higher education. The third volume, Yusuf. You're muted.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I will make 3 points. First of all, we were challenged by the multiple contributions that were submitted by contributors, because all 15 contributors, or sorry, all 15 contributions rather, spoke to the idea of transformative leadership. And then we were challenged, but what kind of, or what type of transformative leadership do you refer to? And we could not identify correctly, so a singular form of transformative leadership that was presented. So what we've done was to look conceptually at the notion of transformative leadership on a continuum. And then we started to speak about a minimalist form of transformative leadership, which would be a thin form of transformative leadership. So the elements in and about transformative leadership would be there, but it would not be as substantive as what we would refer to as a maximalist form of transformative leadership. So on that particular continuum, we mapped the contributions of the contributors, and we found that some of the contributions were either more biased towards a peripheral form of transformative leadership, and others were more inclined towards a substantive form of transformative leadership. And that also made us realize that transformative leadership can then be explained in terms of something else. And we came up with the understanding, what would make this transformative leadership so substantive? And it is when notions of diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion are present. So those meanings would be the constitutive meanings of a substantive form of transformative leadership. And then we made the claim, then that kind of leadership would then be more attuned to the idea of cosmopolitanism. And hence, we thought it apposite to speak about a thick form of transformative leadership as actually a cosmopolitan form of leadership. And that is how that conceptual shift took place. So what makes the leadership cosmopolitan in a way is when it is thickly transformative. And we have, as I've mentioned, mapped the contributions of our colleagues on that particular kind of continuum. But what we've also identified within our understanding of this idea of transformative leadership mapped on a continuum, we can actually extrapolate important themes that make up this particular idea. And the first theme that we've identified was the theme of access, higher education access, and in relation to transformative leadership. So that would be the first theme. And what we've identified, that there were a number of contributions. In fact, the majority of contributions spoke to that particular idea. And here I can just mention, because I'm not going to give the details of each contribution as Mary has requested, I can just mention that the contributions of Dalport and Frick, and then Awad, Arshad Ahmed, and Fatima Iftikhar, and Miaq Fatima, Farah Baig, Faik Wahid and I, and Hamukaya, Bazaraki, Mapling, Honeycomb, and Mukaddam, they all speak to the idea of access, and then, of course, coupled with equity, equality, and transformative leadership, kind of highlighting a notion of transformative leadership in higher education. Then the second theme we identified on that particular continuum would be the notion of decolonization, and of course, coupled with that, the notion of decoloniality, student activism vis-a-vis transformative leadership. And here we've identified the contributions of Russell, Zaid Wahid and Samantha Krieger, Judith Blans and Zane Horel, Blanca Zamanova, Bernadette Johnson, Halitswayo, Wainani and Haywood, and of course also Joseph Hungwe, and then of course Izki Ozionum and Jamila Deshab. They all speak to the idea of decolonization, student activism within higher education as connected to the notion of transformative leadership. And then the final theme that we have identified in this particular volume is couched under the idea of indigenous thoughts for crises and, of course, transformative leadership. And here, the contributions of Danelle Mitchell, Eagle, Etmansky, Haykoop, and then, of course, Bear Chief, Price, and Dean, and then Alan, Matavale, Maafai, Bays, and Funua, they all contributed to enhancing the presence of indigenous insight in dealing with crises and in enacting a notion of transformative leadership within higher education. So what I can conclude is to say that transformative leadership in higher education, looking at this particular volume, can be seen as enabling for fostering a notion of higher education that is equitable, that is reflective of the cultural and epistemological points of view of humans, and of course indicating its bias towards either a balanced or a maximalist notion of transformative leadership in higher education, which suggests that that kind of leadership is mostly biased towards the act of cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
Mary, I think we've reached the end of the initial presentation for the webinar, and I think you've broken the record. I mean, we've never had a presentation which has gone until the last 10 minutes, but I can well understand why you needed to do that, because there's so much material here, and I'm really pleased we've given you the opportunity to explain that a little bit. Obviously, you can't do justice to 4 volumes or even the key ideas in 4 volumes in a webinar of this nature. So I guess all we can do is urge everyone to get hold of the Bloomsbury Handbook and its 4 volumes. Let me ask you a question, though, because it's the one that troubled me when I was writing the foreword. The world situation and higher education is so engaged in society, in politics, in economics, in culture. We're so historically placed now in this period. And the world situation is, in some respects, deteriorating, I think it's fair to say, apart from the obvious nightmare of Gaza and how terrible that is at a world level for all of us. There's the sort of medium-term trends. The multipolar world has emerged. It's not a Western world anymore, but the West doesn't want to let go, doesn't want to lose control, and particularly the United States seems determined to try and weaken other powers that might be contenders for a strong worldwide position. And more disturbingly than that in some ways, but I think related to it, we're seeing the rise of nativism, far-right nationalist politics of bounded on singular identities and closed borders. In much of the West, I don't think it's so much of a phenomenon worldwide, but it's a Western, United States, not so much Canada, United States, and some Western European countries, and the UK too, are showing these symptoms, with a surprising rise in the proportion of populations that would put a dictator into power rather than a democracy which doesn't work very well. And of course, everyone, I think, feels that democracy isn't working very well because from the bottom, we don't have much say over what happens at the top. And yet that's what democracy was meant to do, wasn't it? So how do we, I mean, everything's shifting and changing. How does higher education, and particularly leadership in higher education, deal with this kind of environment? How can we advance the best principles we can advance and achieve something successfully in that process? I think you might be muted.
There we go. Just turned it on. I'm wondering if Patrick or Yusuf would like to take that on. I know, Patrick, you haven't had a chance to contribute a great deal, and I know from your own experience as a leader in higher education and with the different organizations that you are also involved with, I'm sure you're seeing these issues.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate Simon's question. I would say, Simon, I can't remember in all the years I've done this a time when the values of higher education have been, or have felt to be, quite so much at odds with the, in particular jurisdictions, with the approach of governments and more broadly with global issues. I can only come back to the the importance of focusing on the values that our institutions exist to advance, and to the importance of working to keep the consensus around those values strong within the institutions, and then to think creatively about the means pedagogical and through research that we can actually mobilize those values for transformative effect in society. I mean, that to me, the circumstances are particularly acute. Are the tools we have any different from the tools we've traditionally had? I'm not sure, except that I do think from a pedagogical point of view, we have some new approaches through experiential learning, workplace learning, and so on, to take the values of the institution out into the world at large somewhat more effectively. It's not an answer to your question, really. It's just some random reflections about it, but it's a great question. Thanks.
So perhaps one of the issues that came out in the volumes is an insistence that we should still believe in the dynamics of iteration, that you have the right to talk, articulate your points of view, but also have the willingness to face criticism. So unless we are going to continue to advance critique, and unless we are going to contend with resistance and dissent, we might not be defending higher education at all. So just based on the contributions that we have received, there ought to be contributors convinced me in the power of iterative argumentation. Unless we listen to others, speak back, respond critically again, and have the willingness to disagree, our higher education will continue to be in peril. And that, to me, should be something that we have to continue to advance and, in fact, fight for.
Let me add a couple of others in as well, Simon, in terms of, you mentioned the Western notions, Western narratives, Western-based policies. So, and we didn't get to this in the fourth volume, but bringing in, recognizing, pulling together the power of social movements, the indigenous voice, the environmentalist voice, the youth voice, in terms of challenging. And so coming back to voice use, of challenging some of these dominant narratives that have been out there and infiltrated our schooling systems and our institutions of higher education throughout history, but to bring all of those voices back in, as Elizabeth Lang says, to reimagine, and Williams says, to reimagine the way forward. Because if we continue in the path that we are going along, it will continue to lead to further crises. There has to be a pushback. And that could be the role of higher education in terms of research, in terms of policies, in terms of partnerships, to confront and then to reimagine.
I mean, my view is that we need to remake politics, and politics is not working very well at all. And the core of the remaking of politics is Yusuf's point about the role of dissent and the capacity to manage debate and in a way which takes us forward rather than shutting it down. And this is not happening in the United States at the moment over Gaza. It's very serious the way the universities are being closed up as debating forums, or at least not successfully, I might say, but the effort is being made to close them up as places where dissent and discussion can occur. I mean, we played a crucial role in advancing new ideas and advancing critical thinking really throughout the world at many different times in many different places, from Solidarity to Tiananmen to the 68 period all over the world, to the Vietnam period, to the ecology movement, especially in relation to racism, colonialism in the last 20 years. and especially in the United States, universities have been tremendously important, and an example in many respects to the rest of us as places where new ideas have come forward. We have to maintain that role of higher education, that kind of public sphere role, as Habermas called it, which I think Manuel Castells talked about when he went to South Africa too. The importance of the public sphere in higher education as a public sphere, a place where critical ideas can be put forward. So remaking politics might come from those kinds of conversations and others in the community as well outside higher education. We're going to have to stop there. I was going to ask you about the further promotion of the handbook, but I think you're very ably going to take that on. Everyone, I think, would do well to have a good look at this work. There's a lot of material here which will serve us in good stead for the next 15, 20 years, I think. My favourite volume was volume 4, but I thought that all of the volumes really had a lot to say. And everyone will find new ideas in these contributions. Colleagues, it's been my great pleasure to launch and to chair the webinar series of CG since 2020. I'm handing over the directorship of the Centre for Global Higher Education to David Mills after the 31st of May, but we're going to bring David's leadership into the webinars from the next webinar onwards. He will be chairing the webinars, and David, you will be familiar to many of you, especially those who are involved in issues in Africa, but also through his role in the webinars, where he's chaired quite a number of them in the last 2 years. And the next webinar will be, in fact, next Tuesday, chaired by David, and Tuesday the 7th of May, Openness, Collaboration and Higher Education for Good. Now, there's a good positive topic for next Tuesday. Look forward to seeing you all then. And let me say once again, thank you to Mary, Patrick and Yusuf for giving us access to such a vast and impressive body of work as you've done for these 4 Bloomsbury handbooks. Congratulations to you, and congratulations to all the contributors, many of whom are in this webinar, and congratulations to Bloomsbury for supporting such a good publishing project and being such a good publisher to work with. So long, folks, and I wish you all the best. And I will still be here at University of Oxford in the UK and still working away on the same issues as I've been working on for a number of years, and happy to get in touch with people by email. But remember, David Mills is the person to come to now when you have a good idea for a webinar, and keep those good ideas for webinars coming. Bye for now.
Thank you, Simon.